Good evening. I'm Joanna Marsh, the James Dickey Curator of Contemporary Art, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum tonight. This evening's program is the third and final lecture in the Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture series for the 2011 calendar year. And I'd like to extend really special thanks to Clarice Smith, whose generous support makes this whole series possible. So just a little round of applause for Clarice. As always, we would love to hear your feedback after this program and others like it. And our Public Affairs Department is currently conducting an audience survey to help evaluate current programs and develop new ones. And if you'd be willing to participate in the survey, at the end of the program tonight, staff members and volunteers will be handing out survey forms and clipboards that you can just fill out before leaving the museum this evening. And in return, we will give you a free voucher for a coffee or a tea from our Courtyard Cafe, just as a little thank you. I just want to ask everyone to silence their cell phones and mobile devices if you would. There will be a short question and answer period following this evening's lecture. And if you have a question, which we certainly encourage, if you would kindly use one of the microphones that's set up in either aisle in the middle of the auditorium so that we can have our audience tuning in via webcast hear all of the questions and the answers from our speaker. And now it is my really distinct honor to introduce Julie Mehretu, who joins us this evening from New York City, where she lives and works. Mehretu was born in Ethiopia in 1970 and raised in Lansing, Michigan. She received an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1997 and is the recipient of some of the most prestigious art awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship, which she received in 2005. Over the past 10 years, her work has been collected and exhibited at major international museums, most recently in a major survey exhibition at the Guggenheim in New York in 2010. She was also commissioned by Goldman Sachs to produce a major mural, an 85-foot painting in New York City for their building. Mehretu is best known for her densely layered abstract paintings that seem to pulsate with energy. Small clusters of geometric marks are superimposed on vast planes of intersecting grids that derive from a vast array of visual imagery. Flight patterns, floor plans, city maps, and architectural renderings are just a few of the sources that Julie references in her works. All of these are compressed into a dynamic array of patterns and perspectives. Each heavily worked composition seems to oscillate between a state of creation and collapse, just like the ebb and flow of cities and lost civilizations, which Julie references in her paintings. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Julie to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank, everybody for coming out this evening, and I'm honored to be here and appreciate the interest in the work. The title of this talk is. I was asked to give a title, and I've never titled a talk, so I took the opportunity to think about, I titled the talk Gray, and when I was first invited to do the talk, I had just completed the work for the Guggenheim paintings, which were the show was titled Gray Area, and I've been really focused on gray for a while, 15 years, and as well as a lot of color, but so I just thought I would read, just think about gray for a minute to begin with, and then recently I found this article from '67 that was a roundtable conversation about black and the color black, and it was a round table between different sound artists, musicians, painters, Cecil Taylor, Ed Reinhardt, Stu Brumer, Harvey Cohen, Michael Snow, and others. And the idea was to qualify the social political implications of black. Black as stasis, negation, nothingness, and black as change, impermanence, and potentiality. These are some aspects of the experience of black discussed by 7 men in conversation between Toronto and New York in 1967, and it was published in Arts Canada Journal. And for me, when I found this, I was really interested in it because to me, the conversation around black between these different, very little about, it was just a very interesting conversation. So I thought I would open with one, what Cecil Taylor, each participant opened with one statement, and then the conversation continued. And so in '67, this was the conversation, and just thinking of black as really being a part of gray. Taylor says, I think for my first statement, I would like to say that the experience is twofold, and later, I think you'll see how the two really merge as one experience. Whether it's bare pale light, whitened eyes inside a lion's belly, canceled by justice, my wish to be mystic, myopic. You hear me? It's intentional. It's part of the. My wish to be a hued, mystic, myopic region, if you will, least shadow at our discretion, to disappear, or as sovereign, albeit intuitive, sense my charity, dip and grind, fair-haired, swathed, edge to the bottom each and every second, minute, month, existence riding a cloud of diminutive will, caution to waiting, eye and step to wild, unceasing energy, growth equaling spirit, the knowing of black dignity. Silence may be infinite or a beginning, an end, white noise, purity, classical ballet, the question of black, its inability to reflect, yet to absorb. I think these are some of the complexities that we will have to get into. And then another quote that I think, just to set the stage, or and then I'll get into my work, is Kodu Eshun talks about in a lecture, in an essay on operating system for the redesign of sonic reality. He says, at the century's end, the future Hyeth machine has two opposing tendencies, two synthetic drives, the soulful and the post-soul. My work, if I'll just go back to the earlier, to the evolution of the earlier language in the work, or the different operating languages in the work, and talk about how they evolved. And then I think I can talk more clearly about the more recent work. I was always painting and drawing and interested in being able to define build a language in this material, in painting. And I was at an early place, really interested in working with drawing, but I was making all these kinds of marks and painting, and not really understanding in depth how I was working, but I knew that this is the language that I wanted to work with. So early on, I started to take this language and make these marks very, very small, and in an effort to somewhat study them or analyze them. So these marks that I would draw them, and I thought of them as actually behaving by themselves. They don't really have any meaning. But as they participate in a group of marks that behave similarly, maybe they could have a sense of meaning or a sense of being. So one mark, if this mark is exactly the same, as it moves through the surface and the way that the different marks interact with each other, their agency affects the way the entire surface is read, or the way the entire painting picture plane is read. So these groups of marks then, while being so small, had a strong amount of power, had a certain type of power in the picture. And for me, that was what I became, most interested in. That gesture, just even that reality. And so, for me, the drawing, and when I talk about the drawing or the painting in the painting, I'm talking about these marks, these little marks that I work with that began as glyphs, as little notational, not notational, but began as little symbols, almost little marks that had the similar to the marks I showed you earlier, that had a little kind of circle or a line. And anyway, they each had a certain type of social behavior in my mind. And as that language evolved in the last 15 years, the marks became much more notational and less glyph-like. But for me, the drawing operates from a very intuitive, very very intuitive place in the studio. And I think of it as, it has its own evolution. It works similarly to in the way that language works. For me, these marks, the making of it, its realization, it's a materialization. The marks are becoming, their growth. They working in that form. It's a type of insistence on the hand. And to me, there's something really important in that way of working. But at the same time, these marks couldn't exist in a place just, well, they could, and I'm more interested in that now, but at the time I thought they really needed a place of context, a social space, a social space and time, a relationship to this place, so that they weren't in this nether world existing in their own space, which I'm very interested in again at the moment. But 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, as the marks evolved, I really needed a place for them to exist and not just this gray no space. So I started to really think about using architectural language as a place and as a way to offer place and time for these marks and for the drawing, and for the behavioral aspect of the studio process. In addition to the architecture, the architectural language operates then in a very, it has a very specific type of, in the paintings I only use the wireframe line drawings of the architectural buildings or of architectural images. So I'm tracing the photographs, but you don't really see these photographs. You're seeing aspects of these types of structures in the painting, the wireframe line drawings or representations that are see-through of these buildings that are then layered on one another. So sometimes it's just a detail, or it's a much more detail of a building that you really can understand or really connect with in the picture, or it's the layering of all that architectural language that then becomes a different type of space, or suggests some type of mimetic experience. It becomes something. The architectural language provides a certain social context for the viewer, but it also how you interact with the final image between the drawing and the architecture it has a certain type of complex interaction with the person who's viewing it. And each person looks at these very differently through your own personal experience. But for me, the architectural language, I was compressing time in this way, because I could go from the Neolithic through the Renaissance into Beaux-Arts, Art Nouveau, International Style, through to and go back in time again, as many suggestions in architecture somewhat do. But my real interest in that is that each of those moments articulate a particular political and social thinking and attitude and climate and place. And for me, that was it was the compression of all of that into the context of the painting into the context of this space where these characters were interacting or challenging, digesting, participating with this architectural language. There's another process in the studio that's, I think, really important to talk about, which is the mapping or analytical process. There's the intuitive, and then there's the intuitive, which creates the drawing and generates the desire to make pictures and the existence of them. Then there's the mapping and analytical Cartesian process, which is a process of trying to make sense of what I've done in the studio and what I've done in the drawing. And this started early. This was when I first started to, when I was making these paintings and I was looking at them in school thinking, why am I doing these? I took the marks apart to try and study them. And that process of trying to study the work, trying to study my intention, almost study myself, using Cartesian, scientific, rational, systematic methods, mimicking geographical, sociological types of techniques to study and using mechanistic techniques to study the work. So if I made a drawing, I would then literally put a piece of transparent paper over it and map that drawing and codify behavior in the drawing for myself. As absurd as that was, because the next day it could be a different interpretation or a different idea of that. But in a way, this language that really helped me understand what the intention was in the painting, not in the intention, but what structure emerged from within the drawing and how the marks operated and how actually composition was formed and operated. So in the paintings, I would layer the mapping and that language, as well as the different types of approach of that language within the drawing and within the architectural. So some of the images of my work that you've seen there have been paintings that look much more like maps, and other paintings that look like theatrical stadium type of space where the characters and the painting and the drawing interact in this space with aspects of the language of the analytical. And then there's the layer of color in some of the work, when gray is not the color that takes it really. I mean, I think gray is the middle ground in the paintings, but when the color comes in, the color really comes from, usually in the past, and I'm less interested in this now, comes from particular social reality. So in these paintings, these were either colors taken from actual stadiums, maps or plans for these types of spaces, or from parts of these flags, national flags of the nations that exist in the world at the time that this painting was made. And those colors were taken apart and reconfigured into the painting in different ways. But they operate as some type of social signage as well. And there's somewhat of that analytical approach into the use of color. So as the drawing evolved, which was this very intuitive but informed process, and became much more notational, gestural, and action-oriented, my knowledge of architectural history and architectural language and phenomenon also evolved, but only through the study of it, because that wasn't, through the use of it in the paintings. And how particular kinds of buildings would inform the way that we would interact with a painting of a particular scale. So I started to use the stadium clearly is maybe one bookend of what I thought of as a very iconic building for an urban space. The far other side of that would be the military-industrial complex, fortification, the need for fortification. So you have these two types of space: the protective space, the creation of a space, of a public space that is defined somehow, and then the space for spectacle, public arena, stadium, performance, theater, community, in a sense. And these two bookends and their collision for about 5 years, really, and how those two types of different space and what and the theater that space creates in an urban context became really, I think, a focus for my work and for 5-6 years. And this was maybe in 2003 through 2005, 2006. Then one of the things that also happened during that time is my work used to be smaller, map-like work early on. And when I was working with this type of architectural phenomenon, I started to want the paintings to envelop you and become the space, mimic the space of the architectural information that I was dealing with in the work, and that in a way to create this arena. I mean, a social arena has been part of the interest and still is for me, and part of that is because as a viewer you're participating within that social arena. So you're one of the layers in the painting as standing in front of the painting, and your interaction with what you're seeing is, I mean, the painting comes around you and engulfs you, and there's not a way for you as an individual when the paintings reach a large scale to see the whole painting when you're really in front of it, engaged with the drawing. You have to really step back, and as you step back, you get a distance from the picture, and you can really try and see the larger composition, and the painting makes it becomes a different system and makes sense in a different way, the image. But when you're very close to it, you're as immersed in that particular narrative or aspect of drawing as, and then when you move or travel through the painting, it becomes something else. So they're very, your interaction with it is very much like your interaction in an urban space, or mimics that type of idea in a way that that only from a distance can you really understand everything, and even from a distance you can't see the picture in detail. So it's constantly shifting the way that the painting interacts with you as a person, and in many ways this is our interaction with space and time, and how much we can understand or make sense of our social space and time. And another I think focus for me in this work is that as a painter, or an artist, you're really looking for ways to continue to work and continue not just this kind of, for me it's a certain type of, there's a language and there's a commitment to that language and almost an obsession with that language, but there's also, for me, there's this world that I participate in, and the studio practice is one that's very internal, and I have to get into this particular zone to be able to really make and be able to access my working intuitively and be able to really create something in the drawing, even in the characters, that is always becoming in front of me and teaching me something. And making the paintings, conceptually building them and thinking about them and how I will make the next paintings, really there's this, they interact with the world around me. And so the world, what is going on in the world at that time really informs how I'm thinking about what's interesting as a point of departure for what I will do in the studio. But it's not meant to describe or articulate what's happening in the world around me in that sense. It's just a point of departure because these images become part of what I'm digesting, and they become part of my internal, my studio system, if you will, my digestive process in the studio space. So there's all these layers that images and information comes into me, comes into the studio, gets processed, gets digested, and then becomes something else through making. in 2007, I was in Berlin working as a fellow at the American Academy, and while I was there, I was in this place of trying to sort out what would be the paintings I would make for the Guggenheim show. And I was also, I hadn't been to Berlin, and as I didn't have a lot of interest really in Berlin or Germany. I grew up with, my father's Ethiopian, and for some reason there wasn't a lot of excitement. Like if you've come from an Africanist family, there's a lot of interest in learning French or English, but German is not. I mean, in certain places maybe, but really Germany, especially since the war, was really kind of I don't know. Africans aren't that in this way. That's not a big exciting. So there wasn't this drive in me, whereas my partner, Jessica, comes from a family who, she has grandparents who have survived Auschwitz, and there's a different interest in this. She studied German. It was part of her social and cultural background in a way. She had an interest, and her family had traveled there, and so, okay, let's go to Berlin, do the American Academy. And it was incredible because being there, really, it was being in this space where, one, as a city, it took me, just physically, there were aspects of it that reminded me of Addis Ababa, but also architecturally, and there's a reason for that. But it's a city where all of the issues that I'm thinking about in the work, this layering of space, layering of time, history, to make sense of a moment, make sense of myself in a moment, that exists there. That's open there. It's transparent in Berlin. And it was there that I was, what am I going to do next? What am I going to be able to make next in this work? And I had a plan for these paintings for the Guggenheim, where I thought I had this project. I'm going to do these paintings that really focus on these major urban centers throughout the world that were really crucial to me, or I thought so at the time. And I was working on these small paintings in the studio, this being one of them, Veniseri. And while I was working on these paintings, just trying to figure things out, I painted this large colored shape in the center of this painting. I had spent a lot of time drawing in this painting, and there's a lot of architectural language that it's hard to see. And then I sanded this whole section out because I really disliked it. And this was in that process of just making and being intuitively kind of involved with the work. And then when I turned around, there was this, and physically it's much more apparent, there is this almost poltergeist appeared in the painting. And this absence in the center, which became the erasure, became the most interesting action for me. So the marks and the layering of the marks, their behavior contributed to the evolution of this image, to the point where it led, in a sense, in a way, to its own need for a point of collapse. And in that collapse, and I had to erase that or remove that, but there's this trace of that in the picture. And as you're standing in front of the painting, the erasure almost becomes forward. It almost separates from the surface of the image and appears as almost like a phantom revenant right there in front of for me. And that was really an exciting moment. And it took place in Berlin, where that experience, I think, happens regularly in that city. And for me, it became a really potent place to explore, because that also mimics and brings up aspects of thinking about my past and where I come from, and aspects of that past that keep appearing in that way. And so it became, on many different levels, this dragon that I was chasing in the studio. I decided to focus the whole show for Berlin and for the Guggenheim on erasure and that type of gray space, and that space of what I thought of as potential, or when this presence appeared in the painting. This is another painting that was an earlier painting that preceded the other one, but it was an earlier erased picture where I traced, well, an assistant traced each architectural drawing in this book, Architecture Since 1900, each iconic building in that book was traced and then erased once it was drawn into the painting. So from a distance, it looks like this gray, cloudy, mythic dreamscape city, urban space, and futuristic. And then as you come closer to it, you really start to see it defines itself, and you're able to pick out certain pictures, and certain iconic buildings really stand out. And then as you get even closer to it, those lines disintegrate into this dust, they atomized pieces of ink. And it's also somewhat, as you erase it, somewhat gets mashed into the surface of the painting. So this overall hue of gray is within the image, within the surface, within the image of the. So there are these two forms of erasure, and as I was working with and thinking about these paintings for the Guggenheim and being in Berlin, part of the reality of being there was having the responsibility of the Bush administration as the leadership of being a citizen of this country, living in Germany, and working there while there was this major war going on in the world, where in Iraq and Afghanistan specifically, and specifically in regards to Iraq, being in Germany that did not support this situation, and being somewhat, not trying to compare times at all, but or conflate that, but being able to be somewhat sensitive to the reality of an experience of having to take responsibility for your political reality. And so as an American working in Germany, working in Berlin during the Iraq War, that's the context that I was thinking of making the work for that. And so the types of architectural information that I was really looking at were the architectural, the militaristic kind of architectural history. I really studied the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's Atlantic Wall. I was really interested in those ruins. I started to really think about the contemporary ruins that were being created daily through this experience. The space in Berlin is this layered reality, as many cities are, but it's very visible in Berlin, of those current and contemporary ruins, layered and then regenerating to different type of space in front of you. And preceding Berlin, or right after my first 6 months in Berlin, I went back to Michigan, and I was working in Detroit. I had a show at the DIA. And Detroit is another type of city like this. I was, after that, also in New Orleans. It didn't work, and we just took the train through Baltimore, which brings this up. But the evidence of this current or contemporary ruin that surrounds us, and what does that, like, I was really interested in that type of space. So rather than using architectural language that was about built space that had specific social and political intention, this was the remains of that. But how do you work with this type of language? How can I make these paintings with this kind of language that these images aren't already doing? So the earlier desire of building this utopian picture, or looking back in this way at that type of phenomenon, I started to really use the ruin and housing, the type of social, using the context of the arena as a site, maybe for the space that you exist in, that you look at these paintings within. But that didn't really translate into the painting. So the paintings, at this point, I wasn't concerned with them seeming like that type of arena or that type of social space, participating in that, but really being these images in the way that traditional paintings operate, where they are this type of pictorial space where this, but they operate very abstractly, where this action, almost the way an ocean comes in at you, just as a wave just approaches. I wanted these images to operate as pictures do, or paintings traditionally could in a space, and not engulf you in that way, although they are large, but that they become, an image actually appears in them as abstract as they remain. This being one of them. They're 10 feet by 14 feet, so they're quite large, but they don't have the same type of theatrical space maybe, or architectural classical orientation, even though that even as disjointed and broken as that was in the earlier paintings. The drawing, the space, the type of space, the architectural elements that are in the space are really these kind of parts of what construct the other type of space, as well as the drawing, which becomes within that space. In the collision of interacting with that architectural space, creates almost a third space. And this is that third space it's hard to describe, but it really operates in a way. It has its own motion. It has its own intention. It has its own type of. It operates. It has its own behavior. It really, and it interacts within the person. Within each painting has a very different way of behaving in that way, and so I'll maybe talk about this one painting. The architectural language is very hard to see in this image, and a lot of it has been erased, but started with the Believer's Palace, this is a ruin of the interior of it, which is one of Saddam's main bunkers, and. Not palaces, meeting halls where a lot of news conferences were held, and images of him speaking to the public were held in this space. But it had this really complex bunker underneath it. And for me, I just came across this in the Times, and was interested in this type of space that mimicked the interior of some of the Atlantic Wall ruins that I was looking at, the bunkers, but I was really interested in part of the remnant of that space, what happens, but really the kind of classical description of that space that was described in that photograph. And rather than the characters and the marks shifting what the intention was of earlier architectural buildings, like being able to digest and consume, a building that was an international style building that was built a particular way and then become a different kind of picture. So you have this classical structure that was created by the architectural language. The drawing informs that, and it becomes a very different picture. Where the stadium, this becomes the drawing and the erasure and the erasure of the architecture. These bits become other elements. They become almost hyper elements that come together, seem like they're coming together to form something else. What is that? What could that other form be? Is the presence in the erasure, is the presence in the coming together of these marks to create something else? As marks, as drawing, as depiction of space, as nanobots. What could they? How do they come together? And there's a type of opacity that is created by the layering of all that information, but there's also in the erasure this light or paring down that comes out through the painting. This is an image of layers and layers of drawing of these buildings that were built in the early 1900s that were really just early modern buildings, really pre-modern housing in Germany that you see everywhere in Berlin. But that were really, most of these places that we drew into this painting were erased. So in a way, I was looking at the erased space, looking back at these old photographs and redrawing these buildings as they existed in these plazas. But then some of the buildings still exist. But then the erasure happens in the layering and the amount of information and the opacity that is built up through the amount of drawing. And the amount of information that occurs becomes so layered that it almost denies or denies what it is in a way. It also becomes very alive, and when you're in front of it, the painting starts to move, and as you walk through it, it actually starts to visually, you can get, if you really paying attention to it, get a slight vertigo, because it actually starts to, the windows and the way that the drawing interacts, it actually starts to shift. So this show, the interest again was in how these different types of working with erasure and working with this language in very different ways. But really, the focus was on that gray space, on that erased space, and I think it's not even until recently that I am really able to understand that third space that is what emerged from the making of these. That is what I'm interested in, and that the reason these pictures exist is for that third space, this place between the architectural, between the ruin, between the erasure and the drawing. In that collision, that space where maybe something else occurs. This is a painting that is made from the Atlantic wall bunkers. The architectural drawing in it, very, very, very fine lines. I feel like something's moving on the screen. Do you see that? I don't know what that is, but there's behind that movement, there's these lines, the architectural drawing, and those are made up of Hitler's Atlantic wall bunkers, images we had of those, and then we're able to translate into wireframe drawings and then trace into the painting. And then into that, I drew and worked into the very complex space. But those spaces are concrete bunkers, big, Neolithic-looking ruins along the beach. These are Paul Virilio's photos of of a few of these bunkers that remain, that just watched the ocean. And we have some in San Francisco, similar, that I've seen on the Pacific coast. To watch the ocean, you have a big gun in there, and then you can protect yourself from anything that's approaching. Although this space is quite vast, but they're very, to me, super interesting structures, and the materiality of them is not really what you see when you're looking at the painting. The painting has all this transparency, and the drawing is the opposite of that. There's one moment in the top left corner where there's a dark gray patch that maybe suggests their materiality. But this type of being able to see through, being able to move through this trapezoid into this space, and then in that, this kind of presence comes about. This it's almost like a chronotope. It's just right there. You're in the painting, in this space where in that collision you see this. You almost can experience this layeredness of time. And for me, like as I've said about the other Guggenheim paintings, that was really the focus or interest in the work. So this was, in a way, a new way for me to work. And before that, this very layered way of working, where all the architectural language and the gestural drawing and the mark making, and then the maps and the analytical language, their interaction happened on very clear, distinct, separate layers. This way of working really was laying the groundwork for me into a new way of making and making paintings, but also a new way to exist as a painter. And a big at the same time I was working on and started the work for the mural in Berlin. I just have this collection of archive images of types of erased space, so in different ways that exists. but I was thinking of Goldman Sachs, this commission that I received to make this painting. And I was doing that, made that painting at the same time that I made the paintings for the Guggenheim show, the gray area paintings. And a big part of the thinking for the Guggenheim painting was, for the Goldman Sachs painting, mural, was to think, how could I, if I was given the opportunity to make a painting for this space, why would I make a painting for this type of a space? What would be, what could I do that I could not do with my work? If they want to buy a big painting, they're not small paintings that I make. If they want a big painting for the wall, they can. So there had to be a real reason to do it. And for me, there's this wall that they had that was 80 feet by 23 feet tall. And it was a wall that you could see from the street. And so the proposal that we put forth, I went to two friends, an architectural historian, Lawrence Chua, and Beth Stryker, another architect artist friend of mine, and talked to them about this idea that I wanted to create this mural, this absurd idea, to create a mural that could map in a way or become a pictorial realization or idea of the history of capitalism. Is that even something that could be? And so they helped me with this research, really looking into the history of the Bourse and the exchange place and early trade routes, the earliest trade routes. So we split into two. Beth researched the maps that informed, and the earliest maps of the Silk Route and early caravans Lawrence really researched the institutions, these types of structures. From the earliest exposed, outdoor exchanges to, and this, in a way, was always, it was because of these kind of aspects of the urban space and creating a system out of what are these different phenomena that exist in urban space. The market is a big aspect, big, humongous aspect that lies in the middle of the stadium and this military-industrial complex. This is what feeds all of that. And so for me, it felt like a really interesting project. I made this proposal, and they were interested in what would occur in this type of a painting. So Goldman Sachs supported this painting. And these are the images I showed Goldman Sachs in the proposal, the images I'm showing you. Images of the bourses, images of these various types of migration and early maps. And so when we received the commission, we went to Berlin to create the painting because I needed a certain scale space. And that's where I also made the Guggenheim paintings when we went back to Berlin. We rented a massive space that turned out to be a munitions factory owned by Ludwig Lowe before the First World War. This was in this part of town called Wedding, and he created the Luger pistol as well as other major cannons that were used during the First War in this factory, in this setting. And then, of course, it was Aryanized during the Second World War, so that's just part of the layered history of space that was of interest to us. But these were the beginnings of those panels laid out, and there's these pillars that we could build the supports on, and actually recreate the wall that the painting and mural sits on in Lower Manhattan. The early parts of this painting, I went with an idea of drawings that I had made, and I went to Berlin with these drawings and projected this huge idea on the wall, and the painting just collapsed. It didn't hold up because a painting of that scale you can't think of it in a screen like this. You can't think of it on a drawing. It really exists in space. So I had to take apart everything I had put into the painting and do it. We started with just the lines that were informed by the trade route maps, and as well as other kinds of maps. And then into that, I started to project these various shapes that come from a wide source of wide archive of sources. But one thing that really started to happen with this painting, working for this mural, the shapes, I had this history, this key of shapes I'd used in paintings in the past. This is part of that analytical process in the studio, folding it back into the painting. But in that process, I also started to create new shapes that just existed, that suggested something, rather than actually coming from a moment or some type of social, rather than coming from a logo, coming from some type of part of a sign or part of a flag. They actually, they could come from, they were just coming out of the intuitive process of working, but they referenced or seemed to bring up aspects of that. So in a way, this new type of abstraction started to exist in the painting. This was the crew of us that worked. We had 22 people working on the painting at its height, and we had 2 shifts of people working because of the scale to translate the amount of drawing into this surface and into this massive surface of and terrain of abstraction, this kind of map space. In these quotations, these abstract shapes that were operating like almost sonically on this wall. We drew the history of this type of architecture, the type of architecture that it was in, the site of Lower Manhattan as a place for the earliest exchanges in New York, and a center for that in a way, and so this painting becomes, the wall becomes this historical reference within it, but it also becomes a witness for the context that it's in. It exists there in Manhattan, on 200 West Street, across the street from Ground Zero, and it's there for however long it'll be there. But it has this past in it, but it also will participate in the current or future time by just being there, by existing there. So there's this layering, this dimension of space and time within the painting because of the context and what it's mimicking around it. Into this, and into that 2 layers of architectural drawing that are imposed on this, as well as this map type of space, or the more analytic space, if you will, as well as being this kind of reference to early modernist utopian type of mural paintings of the past, and the gestures of that, and the hope that was that those paintings were their intention kind of relied on, or existed on. There was the hand and the gesture, and that gesture and that hand, that's that insistence. That's that within this larger system, within this context, there's this arrogance of the hand, or this type of persistent, urgent, resolute, kind of determined hand and marks that participated and shifted and undulated and affected the surface of the painting. And from a distance, you can see this painting that has an audience, that you can see it from across the street, you can see it from down the street, and it looks like this small little painting at the end of the street. And then as you come closer to it, and if you can go inside to see it, then your interaction with the picture becomes something else. And aspects of the painting, like the orange lines on the top, the yellow squares, those disappear when you're inside. You're only involved with moments of the painting. So it shatters into many, many different paintings. And then the drawing becomes this whole other experience, much more intimate experience. And so this may be the way that if you didn't have any trees or anything in your way, that you could see the painting, except with these bars for the window. There's about 6 different main bars that meter the painting from a distance. You can see this huge composition, and it has a structure, and it has a motion. And then as you come closer, that disappears, and it becomes this other experience. And at first, I really thought that the colored shapes would really be informed by the signage, and in some aspects they are, from various participants in the exchange, in this world of exchange. But, and what I mean by that is really quoting logos and parts of insignia from different banks. But became really uninteresting to me. I mean, I was working on this also, I should say. I got this commission in 2007. We started work at the beginning of the summer of 2008. And by the end of that summer, when we had finished the ground paint, the first layer of the colored painting, we had the summer of 2008, I think at the end of the summer of 2008, August, September of 2008 was a really, I think, very clear. I mean, we all have a real understanding of what happened to this, especially to this world and to every single, to the economic climate of the United States at that time and the world. And although in Berlin they were just like, oh, this is the way it's always been. Berliners were used to it. But so this was the context that we were working on this painting, far away from what was happening. And in a way, maybe the abstraction really shifted, but and became something else. One, because of the demands of the scale, but two, and the painting. And that's what drives the work fundamentally, is the work itself and what the work needs. But also the way that these shapes, and this is what I'm really interested in now, how these shapes that come from, and there are some quotations of other parts of paintings, of other public artworks, of certain types of social meaning, and so the signage, there's some of that, but they become other things. They're drawings that they become their own shapes, and they become major agents in the painting, like that big red shape on the bottom right, the blue robotic shape in the middle, the orange square, the yellow-red shape flying off on the left, the pink triangle, the type of camouflaged shape on the top right. And so, for me, those shapes and their agency, the agency of that color became really is really important to me still. And that's moving. That's coming back to gray somehow. I'm not sure. I'm working on. I'm really making. But gray. Everything in my studio right now is still very gray. After that, I did two paintings. Really, that I had been working on since I came back to New York, and my studio now looks over the Hudson River, and I drive down the Hudson River every day from where I live in Harlem, and the river became really important to me just because it was at one part of the city I saw daily, and it was one part of the world that I saw every day, and it changes every single day. It's a different color, it's a different experience, and this is in a way the climate of when I started drawing into these paintings. But I was asked to do this project for a space in Venice that had a very square shape to it, and it was in an old customs house, and it was a central space in this old customs house. And if you really look at the map of Venice, it's almost right in the center of Venice, but it's also historically was a point of introduction to the city, and it's in the Punta della Dogana, which is the triangular point that comes out right across from the Doge's Palace in Venice, and in that building, which was the customs house, and where everyone who went through Venice had to process through that space. This space I was interested in. If you looked at it on a map, you created this. You were to look at it with this Cartesian model. There's right in the middle of that space, you could drop a grid, and because it was a cube, I thought of creating, and I was to make something for the space, two paintings, one that was vertical and one that would be horizontal. And I had this format, but I didn't really know what I would do architecturally with the images. But I had this vista out of my studio of the river and of New York, and the river brought up Venice for me, I mean, very just fundamentally. And these cruise ships came in, the same cruise ships you see in Venice when you're in Venice. But so it became very clear. But then, as I started to just think about that, you know, New York City has the fortified walls all around it as well, especially Lower Manhattan. And these were really built to create these ports along and to make it a much more functioning harbor, but also in a way to protect the city. Now it has to be reconsidered in terms of the water, but to be able to really protect the buildings that were being built in the city from the water itself. And there are many other relationships to Venice that can be made. So for me, it wasn't like I was trying to make some major conceptual argument for these two places, but just having done this big painting that was thinking about this, the industry and context and world of finance, to try and take the language back and to think about the language that I had been making in the Guggenheim paintings, which I was making at the same time as that mural. I wanted to try and, I was thinking about, you know, naturally New York and Venice as these two major centers for that type of exchange. And so I made these, the horizontal painting, New York, the vertical painting, Venice, architecturally, and just thought I would look at that, at those two types of different architectural phenomena. A lot of Venice and what happens in those buildings exists all through New York. And at the same time, there's this major shift. It started in January in our social reality and in the global social reality. And that informs, I think, the action of the drawing in the painting of in New York. It wasn't really an intention. I'm thinking of it really now, looking back at the painting. But for me, this painting built from the architectural elements of New York really, in a sense, becomes something. I mean, as that source, I use that source to then create this other image, and with the interaction of the drawing, and the drawing really takes over, and the erasure and that gray space. Maybe it's not the drawing takes over, but that third space takes over, and these major presences appear in the painting. This painting is about 22 feet wide or 23 feet wide, 10 feet tall. And the vertical painting is about 12 feet wide and 15 feet tall. The vertical painting doesn't have any of the hand or the gesture in it. This is the space that the paintings were in, and there's a skylight above the paintings. And through that skylight, the vertical painting, on the other side of that vertical painting, there's a dome. And it's almost, there are many buildings that are drawn upside down in the top of the vertical painting. The vertical painting, as I said, is all architectural drawing, bits, all tracings of these elements of the kind of, the exhibitionism of, and kind of intention of Venetian, this space that you see when you arrive in Venice, this type of braggartly type, really showy type of gesture that you would see in that architectural language. And it was, to me, I was really, I mean, it's an incredible achievement, what occurs in that, when you approach that city. It's so small. There's this kind of intense capitalist insistence and showiness in historically when you're thinking about what those buildings do. And so these are tracings of all that detail. So you have that on the other side of this intense action. There's no third space in this, if other than the layering of all the drawing and where these little aspects of the architectural details start to actually become or vibrate in their own existence in the surface of the painting. But it's almost as if the dome folds in on the space. So for me, the thinking of the paintings occur in the space, in the city, in a larger global context. But there are also these two images that are interacting with one another and creating almost there's this third space that exists between them in their in the room that they were made for. So I'll end on an image of the Nile River in Daniel Joseph Martinez's catalog for the Cairo Biennial. He took a photograph of the Nile, and I find it as just an interesting image, since it was the Hudson I was looking at as the end image for the talk. Thank you. So if there's any questions, how should we do that? Okay. Okay, so I'll start on the other side. Okay.
Yeah, about the Goldman Sachs painting.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me the first time I saw it is that I saw it very close to the time that it was installed. And of course, global markets were crashing and all that kind of stuff. And it just seemed to me that it described, in some way, the inability to really comprehend all that financial information. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I mean, in terms of as an image?
Yeah, the image, you can't even see it all because of the...
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's like, seems like it's one person's look on how all that information could be digested, but then it just seems like it's one of those tasks that's just futile.
Yeah, it's futile. I think I was speaking to somebody at Goldman Sachs just about the archiving information, and they have 2 archiving centers of information that just to archive. I mean, this is DC, this is everywhere, I'm sure, but where the amount of energy used to archive these two places in New York State that each one consumes the amount of energy of White Plains, New York. To archive information just by itself, and there's doubles. You know, they have to have 2 of each of those. So, I mean, and I'm sure that is for every. That's just one, one. So yeah, I mean, it's futile. The project itself was futile. In a sense, painting has this challenge. What's the point of making a painting today? And part of the reason I paint and draw is this, and part of that is that determination that each person, or that it's this insistence on being on the individual, on the self, on that agency. And so in that picture, I don't think that picture is trying to be. There's a sense of it. I mean, I don't think its intention is not to be mimetic in a way. Its intention is to become this other experience that exists in this, but using all of that as a point of departure. But it's not at all trying to be descriptive.
I'm curious how you decide to place the tracings that you do of the architecture onto your larger canvas. Do you just put them one on top of the other, or do you space them out?
All over. I mean, it depends on the image. Usually, I'm thinking of creating a particular type of space. So I collect, for example, with the Goldman Sachs painting, had this huge archive of images. And from those, I worked into the painting, and I would work one image at a time, layering them into the painting where I thought they needed to be to create space. That process, putting them in the painting, is somewhat intuitive. And as the space evolves, there's a very kind of informed idea of how that space could change. And when you put 2 buildings on top of one another, how they interact. I mean, and having worked with that type of language for the last 10 years. It informs the way that you think about how you're going to, and so each time I'm trying to also do something for myself that's interesting and challenging the way that I will interact with that space. So it's really about creating a particular kind of space or an opacity of space within the layering of that space.
I just had a question about how you feel in your position as a painter and being someone who uses so much drawing. How do you feel that you are working within painting or as an artist in the history of painting, or do you feel free from that genre? I guess I'm just curious, how do you take on sort of the history of painting in the way that you work now?
I mean, I'm a painter. I think of myself as a painter and making paintings. And I draw as a big part of that process, but they don't exist on paper on the wall or on another support. Really, I construct these. I work on canvas and I stretch it over a stretcher that even the mural was made that way. So it's stretched canvas over stretchers that come together to create this large painting. And for me, there's something I'm very invested in that. The material I work with is all acrylic paint and ink. And all the color are all various types of acrylic paint. The surface is very considered and is also made from different types of acrylic paint and other materials. So I don't think drawing on the painting takes it outside of painting. I mean, I think there are other aspects and approach and the way that I approach the work that try to deal with the history of painting differently or contribute to that, but it's not really, I mean, they're paintings, I think of them that way.
Yeah, I have a question. I see you applied your technique towards man-made structures. Have you thought about applying it towards things in nature, like repeating patterns like factoral designs, repeating geometric structures? Have you thought about that maybe?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting area and I have a lot of images of that type of information but somehow in the drawing and in the layering of the information, what I'm interested in, that almost occurs somehow. Maybe it could occur, it doesn't really, but maybe it could suggest that that's occurring in the paintings, in the interaction of the mark making and the various types of information that get layered into the painting. So in a way, my hope is that they behave that way through their evolution. But yeah, sure, I'm looking at that information.
Hi, I was wondering if you knew, or it seems to me that your work is extraordinarily related to Gordon Clark's work, who did a lot of physical cross-sections of buildings that were going to be demolished. Mm-hmm. And I think about how you almost take 3D influences and then apply them in a 2D setting, but then somehow incorporate like 4D, I think of like hypercubes and like time. Mm. And so I was wondering a little bit about how 3D, kind of the 3D venue would play into your work while it's absent from the images that you create in a way. All the images that you showed in between your own work were so extraordinarily physical in 3D.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there was a question there, but there are a lot of questions in here that relate to those comments.
I appreciate that, thank you. No, I mean, it's the question about sculpture?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the process of working for me is very slow. It evolves very slowly. I try to work as fast as I can, and it's still the steps are pretty, I think, very slow. So, I mean, I make from the world that exists, but I'm making abstract paintings, abstract pictures. very 2D pictures, but they suggest this type of. So that's a question that I've been thinking about that leap into space. I'm working with that in the studio, and I'm not really in a place to be able to talk about it really, but yeah, definitely it's a presence there. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I have a little bit more of a personal question, I guess, about the third space that you were talking about that emerges in some of your paintings. And I'm just wondering what your emotional reaction is to the third space when it does occur, and how you relate to it, what kinds of feelings come up, and if you could describe those a little bit more, what it means to you and where you think that would take you in your future work.
It's that third space is so hard to describe and talk about because it's really about experience, and but I don't know that it's all. I mean, sometimes it's an emotional response, but in the way that I would have an emotional response to a lot of the photographs that I showed in the talk as well. But for me, it really, it's a space where something else can occur. It's a space where, let's say it's a place of potential, but it's also a space that of everything that has ever happened in this space. It's the space of the sublime, if you will. It has this. There's an experiential aspect to that occurs when you're in front of it, the piece. And that's really the thing about painting, is that you have to be in front of painting. You have to stand in front of it or sit in front of it, and you have to stay there for a long time for painting to really make sense. And I say that about anybody's paintings. They require that type of attention, and in a way that they operate, especially these paintings for me operate like a lot like film. Like you have to really let the painting emerge, and it takes that time. So, thank you.
What's your literary philosophical area? What do you like? We had a very literary artist last lecture.
Yeah.
And she really referenced a lot of personal, deep meanings and things. What do you have?
Yeah. That's like that your Facebook page. What is it? Your political orientation? Is that what it is? Political. What is it called? I don't really use Facebook, but there's. You have your status, your relationship status, and then you have your political affiliation and religious affiliation. Everything is listed. But I'm not really a Facebook user. I think that what I read and what I wanted to really try and talk about in this talk is something else. There are times where particular books play a big role in the work, but I don't. I can think of one just offhand right now when I was really looking at the history of the ruin and the history of the use of the military-industrial complex. I was reading Austerlitz by Sebald at the time, and so that kind of really structured or informed that the way I was thinking about those paintings. But I read. I mean, it wasn't really a focus of the conversation tonight because, intentionally, but yeah, that. I participate in the world fully. I don't just, I'm not just reading the news or paying attention to that side of what exists. I think it. But anyway, thank you.
Oh, there's one more here, if you don't mind. Hi.
No, hi.
I wanted to say thank you, first of all. You're one of my favorite artists, and I really appreciate you coming out. I'm always drawn to your work when I see it. I just had a few questions. I saw the last images you had up of the uprising this past spring and winter. is that supposed to show us what's to come? What is going to be influencing your work?
The Arab Spring, the images of the Arab
Right.
Spring. I think that that was just what was happening. Like I had the computer. I took a photograph of myself in the computer just to show. I had that when those major, and that was happening in Tahrir Square in Egypt. I mean, that was playing in the studio as I was drawing. That was occurring. So it was just what was happening, just to give a context for what was going on in the world around me. But it was in the studio too, because I was playing that on the computer live on the television, if you will. So it was really not necessarily about the future in the practice, but just about that time that I was making those paintings. Thank you very much.